It is July 16, 1977, and a yellow Formula One car has just retired from the British Grand Prix at Silverstone with a blown turbocharger. This is not news. The yellow car has retired from almost every race it has entered. It retired in Argentina, it retired in Brazil, it retired in South Africa. At Monaco it did not even qualify. The mechanics who work on it have developed a dark sense of humor about the situation because the alternative is despair. The car is called the Renault RS01 and it is powered by a 1.5-litre turbocharged engine in a Formula One field where every other competitor runs a 3.0-litre normally aspirated unit. The paddock calls it the Yellow Teapot. The name is not a compliment. It refers to the clouds of smoke and steam the car produces when its turbocharger fails, which is frequently what nobody in the paddock is saying, what nobody wants to say, because the evidence so far does not justify saying it, is that the Yellow Teapot might be the most important racing car in the field. That in 3 years, the engine concept it is pioneering will be producing more than twice the horsepower of the cars currently laughing at it. That by 1983, every serious Formula One constructor will have abandoned the 3.0-litre formula entirely and converted to turbocharged power. That the turbo era those engineers triggered will produce the most powerful racing cars in the history of the sport. This is the story of the Renault RS01, the car that was wrong about everything except the one thing that mattered. To understand why Renault built the RS01, you have to go back to a regulation that most people in Formula One had read and then quietly set aside. The FIA's regulations permitted 2 engine configurations, a 3.0-litre normally aspirated unit or a 1.5-litre supercharged unit. The 1.5-litre option had never been used in the 3.0-litre era because, on paper, a 1.5-litre engine could not match the output of a 3.0-litre unit running without forced induction, on paper. Renault's engineers had been studying turbocharger technology through their sports car and rally programs and had reached a different conclusion. A turbocharged engine, one that uses exhaust gases to drive a compressor, forcing additional air into the combustion chamber, can produce far more power per unit of displacement than a normally aspirated engine. The limiting factor in combustion is not the size of the engine, but the amount of air-fuel mixture burned in each cycle. If you could force enough air into a 1.5-litre engine at sufficient pressure, the theoretical power output was not limited to what a 3.0-litre engine could produce. It was limited to what the engine's components could withstand. This was the bet Renault made, not on a 1.5-litre engine, on a 1.5-litre engine with a turbocharger that nobody had yet built to survive Formula One conditions. The turbocharger itself was the central engineering problem. A turbocharger is driven by exhaust gases, which means that power only arrives after exhaust gases have built sufficient pressure to spin the turbine. At low engine speeds, the turbocharger produces very little. Then, above a certain threshold, the exhaust pressure reaches the point where the turbine accelerates rapidly and the compressor begins forcing air into the engine in quantity. The power output rises extremely quickly, not gradually, but in a surge that in early turbocharged Formula One engines could arrive with almost no warning. This was turbo lag. In a 1977 turbocharged Formula One car, a driver exiting a slow corner was effectively driving 2 different vehicles in the space of a single corner exit. For the first 2 or 3 seconds, a normally aspirated car. Then, without warning, something producing perhaps 150 horsepower more than it had a moment before. Getting this power to the track without spinning the rear wheels required a combination of driver skill and mechanical engineering that nobody had solved yet. Renault's engineers spent 3 years solving it. The RS01's 1977 season was, statistically, a failure. It started 7 races and finished 1, a 4th place at the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. The turbocharger failed. The engine failed, the intercooler failed. Components that had worked perfectly on the test bench failed under the vibration, heat, and mechanical stress of a Grand Prix weekend. Every failure was a data point. Every data point was an engineering lesson. Renault's engineers were not disheartened. They were, in the most literal sense, conducting research. The RS01 was not a racing car in the competitive sense. It was the most expensive development mule in the history of the sport. Jean-Pierre Jabouille, who drove the RS01 throughout its first season, was himself a key part of the development process. An engineer as much as a driver, he could describe the car's behavior in terms that the development team could translate directly into hardware changes. He described the turbo lag with a precision that no other driver might have articulated. Without Jabouille, Renault's turbo program might have taken years longer. With him, it took until 1979. By 1979, the RS01 had evolved into the RS10, and Renault's engineering program had solved enough of the turbo lag problem to make the car competitive. At the French Grand Prix at Dijon-Prenois on July 1, 1979, Jean-Pierre Jabouille drove the Renault RS10 to pole position and victory. It was the first turbocharged engine victory in Formula One history. Within 12 months, Ferrari had a turbocharged engine in development. Within 18 months, Brabham had one. By 1983, Cosworth, whose normally aspirated DFV had powered more Formula One victories than any other unit in history, had been effectively rendered obsolete. The 3.0-litre formula, which had defined Formula One since 1966, was dead. The rivals' response to Dijon was not immediate panic. It was something more calculated and more dangerous. A recognition that the turbo concept was not a quirk of one race on one circuit, but a permanent shift in what Formula One engineering meant. BMW's four-cylinder turbocharged engine would eventually produce qualifying outputs of over 1,400 horsepower in a 1.5-litre unit weighing 145 kilograms. Honda's RA163E would power Williams and Brabham to multiple championships. Renault, having pioneered the technology and absorbed 2 years of failures, found itself leading a race that every major manufacturer in the sport was now running to catch up with. The Yellow Teapot had become the template. The turbo era peaked, technically, in the mid-1980s. Qualifying engines producing between 1,350 and 1,500 horsepower were developed by Honda, BMW, Ferrari and Renault, figures that no normally aspirated engine could approach. The FIA banned turbocharged engines from Formula One at the end of the 1988 season. The RS01 itself is not widely remembered. The car that won, the RS10 at Dijon, has a place in the record books. The RS01 that made it possible sits in the Renault Museum at Boulogne-Billancourt. It looks fragile, it looks unreliable, it looks like a car that should not have been competitive. That is precisely what the paddock said in 1977, and the paddock was right about everything except the ending. The Yellow Teapot. The car that blew smoke every time it retired and made the rest of the paddock laugh. The car that ended a 17-year technical formula, triggered an arms race in forced induction that produced the most powerful racing engines in history, and proved that in Formula One the correct bet is never the obvious one. The RS01 is not remembered the way winning cars are remembered. There is no famous victory lap, no championship photograph, no moment where the crowd rose to its feet for a Renault. What it left behind is something harder to photograph and harder to forget. A gap in the regulations that one team had the patience to find, the engineering discipline to exploit, and the willingness to look ridiculous for 2 years while doing it. The teams that laughed at the Yellow Teapot in 1977 spent the next 6 years trying to build one. Honda invested years and hundreds of millions of dollars developing a turbocharged engine that would eventually power Williams to back-to-back championships. BMW produced a four-cylinder unit that in qualifying trim generated more power per litre than any engine Formula One had ever seen. Ferrari re-architected their entire power unit program around the forced induction principle. All of them were following a path that Renault had walked first, alone, in a yellow car that retired more often than it finished. The FIA banned turbocharged engines at the end of 1988, 11 years after the RS01 appeared at Silverstone. 11 years of the most powerful racing engines in the sport's history, triggered by a car that the paddock thought was a joke. The punchline took 11 years to arrive, but it arrived.